I can still recall the heaviness of that loss when I was 5, the emptiness that filled the space after my mother passed away. At that age, I barely grasped the concept of death, but I knew the impact of her absence. It lingered in the silence of the house and in the way my father's hands rested on the back of his chair during dinner, as though he were waiting for her to sit beside him. At just 23, my father became my entire world. He was young, strong, and determined. While others might have been overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, he rose every day, tirelessly working to build a life for us. I admired him even before I truly understood the meaning of admiration. He spent long hours at the factory, his hands roughened and his smile weary when he came home. Yet he always found the energy to kneel beside my bed and read me stories. In those moments, I felt the safest. I loved hearing his rare laughter and seeing the way his eyes crinkled when he looked at me, as if I was everything to him. Now, at 17, I stand on the verge of adulthood. My 18th birthday is just a week away, and although the future seems both vast and intimidating, I can't help but wonder how my father feels about the years slipping by. I am his daughter, but for so long I've also been something more, a partner in a quiet, unspoken bond forged from shared grief and survival. In many ways, my birthday feels like a turning point, not only for me, but for both of us. It feels as though the world is testing the strength of the cocoon we've created together, one that has protected us from so much. The morning of my 18th birthday was unlike any other. The scent of something sweet and warm drifted into my room, pulling me from sleep. I stretched, rubbing my eyes, and for a moment, I forgot the significance of the day. Then I saw the soft light of morning streaming through my window and remembered that today I was officially an adult. As I padded into the kitchen, the sight stopped me. My father stood at the stove, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, his dark hair a little messy, but somehow still fitting. The table was set with a level of elegance I'd never seen before. 2 plates, polished silverware, and a vase filled with the largest bouquet of crimson roses I'd ever seen. "Good morning, birthday girl," he said, turning toward me with a smile that softened his features. His eyes lit up when they met mine, and for a moment I saw something new, perhaps quiet pride, or maybe the weight of 18 years flashing through his mind. "Dad, what is all this?" I asked, though my grin revealed how touched I was. "Breakfast," he replied simply, as though it weren't the most thoughtful thing he had done in ages. "You're 18 now, and that calls for something special." I moved closer, drawn in by the delicious scent of pancakes and syrup. "You didn't have to do all this." His brow furrowed playfully, but his tone was firm. "Of course I did. My little girl isn't so little anymore." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning, though he didn't linger on them. Instead, he motioned for me to sit. After I did, He stepped into the hallway briefly, returning with something wrapped in silver ribbon. He placed it in front of me and stepped back, as though waiting for my reaction. "What's this?" I asked, my hands hovering over the gift. "Open it," he urged, his voice softer, almost tender. I carefully untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside was the most beautiful dress I had ever seen. Deep, vibrant red, shimmering in the light. My fingers brushed over the fabric, soft and smooth, and my heart swelled in surprise. "Dad," I whispered, looking up at him, "you deserve something beautiful," he said steadily. But his expression was raw in a way I hadn't seen before. "Something as stunning as you are." His compliment took me by surprise, and I felt my cheeks flush. His words were kind, but there was a depth to them that left me unsure how to respond. "Thank you," I said, standing to hug him. His arms enveloped me with a warmth I knew well, yet in that moment it felt heavier. "Try it on," he suggested, stepping back with a soft smile. I nodded and went to my room to slip into the dress. It fit perfectly, hugging my figure in a way that made me feel both confident and self-conscious. When I returned, my father's reaction was immediate. His gaze swept over me, and he smiled, a mix of pride and something else I couldn't quite identify. "You look—" He paused, as though searching for the right word. "Beautiful." I twirled, laughing softly, trying to shake off the odd new energy between us. "It's perfect," I said, and I truly meant it. The rest of the morning felt like a dream. The breakfast was delicious. Pancakes, fresh fruit, and coffee, just the way I liked it. My father was more attentive than usual, complimenting me frequently and ensuring I had everything I needed. At one point, he reached across the table to brush a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering for a brief moment. The gesture was so gentle, so careful, that I didn't pull away. Instead, I met his gaze and saw something in his eyes I couldn't fully understand. "You've grown up so fast," he said softly, almost to himself. 18 years isn't that fast," I replied, trying to lighten the mood. He chuckled, though his smile was bittersweet. "Feels like yesterday you were running around in pigtails, dragging that stuffed bunny everywhere you went." I laughed, recalling the memory. "Benny the bunny. You hated that thing," he said. "I didn't hate it," I corrected, shaking my head. "I just hated how I couldn't wash it without you crying." The conversation drifted into stories of my childhood, moments I had nearly forgotten, but he remembered with startling clarity. Each memory felt like a gift, a reminder of how present he had been in every stage of my life. Yet beneath the laughter and nostalgia, something shifted. He began treating me not just as his daughter, but as a grown woman. It was in the way his compliments lingered, the way his hands brushed mine when he passed the syrup, the way his gaze softened whenever I spoke. As the day went on, I felt the weight of his attention more intensely. When I stood to clear the table, his hand rested lightly on my shoulder, stopping me. "Let me," he said gently but firmly. I smiled and stepped aside. Thank you, Dad, for everything. You don't have to thank me, he said, his eyes meeting mine with sincerity. I just want you to be happy. Always. The day wasn't over, but already it felt like the most special birthday I'd ever had. Though I couldn't put it into words, I sensed that this birthday wasn't just a milestone for me. It was one for him, too. The rest of the morning felt surreal, filled with warmth I hadn't experienced in such a profound way before. My father hovered near me, his every action brimming with an attentiveness that made me feel cherished. As we sat in the living room sipping tea, he turned to me with a smile that softened his features. You know, you remind me so much of your mother, he said tenderly, his voice almost wistful. I paused, my cup halfway to my lips. It wasn't the first time he'd said this, but today the words felt different, heavier. Really? I asked, setting the cup down and meeting his gaze. He nodded. Just as beautiful, just as kind. His eyes softened, and his voice grew quieter. She would be so proud of you, the young woman you've become. A warmth spread through me, and I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. That means a lot, Dad. Thank you. The compliment lingered in the air, wrapping around me like a comforting embrace. I loved hearing about my mother, even if it was bittersweet. I didn't remember much about her, as I was so young when we lost her. But the way my father spoke of her made me feel connected to her in a way words couldn't fully capture. You know, he continued, his tone lighter, today is your day. How would you like to spend it? I tilted my head, considering the question. I don't know. This morning has been so perfect, I haven't thought about anything else. Well, he said, leaning back with a playful grin, I might have planned a little something for this evening, if you don't mind. Oh? I asked, curiosity piqued. What kind of something? He smiled, his expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. I made a reservation at a nice restaurant. It's nothing too fancy, but I thought it would be special. Of course, only if you're up for it. The idea of an evening out, just the two of us, filled me with anticipation. I'd love that, I said earnestly. Good, he replied, his smile widening. I'd like you to wear the dress I gave you, if that's okay. I nodded, my heart fluttering at the thought of all the effort he'd put into making this day so memorable. It's more than okay, Dad. Thank you. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of quiet moments and unspoken emotions. We spent the afternoon reminiscing and laughing over shared memories, as if the world outside had melted away, leaving just the two of us in a bubble of connection and warmth. As evening approached, I slipped into the red dress. Its fabric hugged me like it had been made for me, which, in a way, it had. I stood before the mirror, adjusting the straps and smoothing the skirt, my reflection catching me off guard. I looked different, older, more poised. When I emerged from my room, my father was in the living room, adjusting the collar of his dark blazer. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, and for a moment his expression froze. You, he started, his voice trailing off as his eyes swept over me. You look stunning. Heat rushed to my cheeks, and I glanced down, nervously smoothing the fabric. Thank you, Dad. No, he said, stepping closer. You look perfect. The sincerity in his voice made my heart swell, and I couldn't help but smile. You clean up pretty well yourself, I teased, trying to lighten the mood. He chuckled, offering his arm. Shall we? The restaurant was as charming as he'd described. Soft lighting bathed the room, creating an intimate and elegant atmosphere. He had reserved a table by the window, where we could look out at the city lights, twinkling like stars. As we settled into our seats, he reached across the table, gently taking my hand in his. Thank you for letting me plan this, he said, his eyes meeting mine with a depth that made my breath catch. Thank you for everything, I replied, squeezing his hand. This is the best birthday I could have imagined. The evening unfolded like a dream. The food was delicious, the conversation flowed easily, and laughter filled the air. He told stories about my mother and their early days together, each one painting a vivid picture of the love they had shared. She had this way of lighting up a room, he said softly, just like you. I felt my cheeks flush again, but this time it wasn't from shyness. It was warmth, a feeling of being seen and cherished. As the night wore on, the closeness between us deepened. He was attentive in a way that felt both familiar and new, pulling out my chair, pouring my water, making sure I was comfortable. It was as though he wanted to make every moment count, to etch this day into both of our memories. When we finally returned home, the house was quiet, and the day's events lingered in the air like the soft glow of candlelight. Dad, I said as we stood by the door, this was the best birthday I've ever had. He smiled, his eyes shining with something I couldn't quite identify. I'm glad, he said. You deserve it. I leaned in to hug him, and he held me close, his embrace steady and warm. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence speaking more than words ever could. Happy birthday, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Thank you, I responded, my voice shaking with emotion as I stepped back. Our eyes met, and I realized that today wasn't just about celebrating my birthday. It was about celebrating him, the bond we had formed, and the love that had carried us through so much. The evening felt like a dream I didn't want to wake from. The warmth of the restaurant still lingered in my heart as we returned home. The soft click of the door closing behind us, grounding me in the moment. My father, though maybe I should call him something else now, was unusually quiet as he placed his keys on the counter, his movements slow, as though lost in thought. Can I ask you something? He said after a pause, his voice softer than usual. Of course, I replied, curious. He turned to me, his expression gentle yet thoughtful. Tonight, just for tonight, would you call me by my name? I blinked, taken aback. You mean, yes, he interrupted, almost shyly. Just Ethan, not Dad. I hesitated, trying to process the request. It felt odd, almost forbidden, yet the earnest and vulnerable look in his eyes made it impossible to refuse. Okay, Ethan, I said cautiously, testing the name. It felt foreign but strangely fitting in that moment. His smile was small but genuine, as if I had given him an unexpected gift. Thank you, he said quietly. I wanted to ask why, but the moment didn't feel like it needed any questions. Instead, I let the silence fill the space between us, warm and unspoken. As I started to head to my room to change out of the dress, he stopped me with a gentle touch on my arm. Wait, he said, his tone light but purposeful. I want to take a picture of you. A picture? I asked, caught off guard. He nodded, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. You look stunning tonight, and I want to capture that. You know, I used to take so many pictures of your mother. She always said they were her favorite because they weren't for anyone else, just for us. His words brought a pang of bittersweet emotion, but the way he said them made me feel special. Okay, I agreed, smiling. Where do you want me? Wait here, he said, disappearing into the living room. I followed after a moment, curious, and found him adjusting a small lamp to cast a warm, golden light. He turned off the overhead lights, leaving the room bathed in a soft glow. Perfect, he murmured, stepping back to admire his work. Stand here, by the window. I did as instructed, feeling the smooth fabric of the red dress against my skin as I moved. The light from the lamp made the color of the dress appear richer and deeper. He raised his camera, an old one I hadn't seen in years. Just relax, he said soothingly. You don't have to pose. Just be yourself. I laughed softly, feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. Easier said than done. You're doing great already, he said, snapping the first photo. His voice was steady, calm, like a painter admiring his canvas. Tilt your head a little. Yes, just like that. You're beautiful. Heat rose to my cheeks at the compliment, but I followed his guidance, feeling both self-conscious and flattered as the camera clicked. He continued offering soft praise. That smile suits you, he said at one point. You have the same spark your mother had. It's mesmerizing. His words wrapped around me, filling the room with an intimacy I hadn't expected. For a moment, I felt as if I were seeing myself through his eyes, not just as his daughter, but as someone radiant and worthy of celebration. When he lowered the camera, his expression was unreadable for a moment, then softened into something I could only describe as pride. I think that's enough, he said, setting the camera down gently. But you were perfect. I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. I'm not sure I've ever been called perfect before. You are to me, he said simply, stepping closer. His voice was calm, yet it held a quiet truth that made my heart ache in the best way. He reached out and pulled me into a hug. His arms felt stronger than usual, and the embrace lasted longer than it might have on any other day. I rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my cheek. You've grown into an amazing woman, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite name. Your mother would be so proud. Thank you, I whispered, my voice catching. He leaned back slightly, enough to look at me, and pressed a gentle kiss to my cheek. It wasn't unusual for him to show affection, but tonight the gesture felt deeper, as if it carried everything he couldn't express in words. As he pulled away, his hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment before he stepped back. I'll make us some tea, he said, his tone returning to its usual warmth. Why don't you change into something comfortable? I nodded, my heart still fluttering from the intensity of the moment. Okay, I said, giving him a small smile before retreating to my room. As I slipped out of the dress and into my favorite sweater, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair was slightly tousled, my cheeks still flushed, and my eyes held a brightness I hadn't seen in a long time. I looked different. I couldn't quite explain it, but something between us had shifted that night. Something unspoken, yet undeniably real. As I made my way back to the kitchen, the warmth of it lingered in my chest, like the golden glow of the lamp still illuminating the living room. The air felt different as I walked back into the living room, still glowing with the soft, warm light Ethan had set up earlier. He was standing at the counter, preparing tea with quiet focus, making the moment feel even more intimate. It was hard to reconcile how much had changed between us in just one evening. When he looked up and saw me, his expression softened. I was just about to bring this to you, he said, holding up 2 steaming mugs. I smiled as I walked over to him. I'm not used to all this attention, I admitted with a quiet laugh. You deserve it, he said simply, handing me one of the mugs. His voice was calm, but the way his eyes lingered on me spoke volumes. We moved to the couch, the room now bathed in peaceful stillness. The warmth of the tea and the soft hum of the evening made everything feel almost surreal. As we sipped in comfortable silence, I found myself stealing glances at him, studying the way the light caught the lines of his face. He looked tired, but in a way that carried a sense of peace, as though this evening had meant as much to him as it had to me. I have something to say, he said suddenly, setting his mug down on the table and turning to face me fully. My heart skipped a beat. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, his hands resting on his knees as he searched for the right words. Tonight has been special, he began, then trailed off with a soft exhale. Not just because it's your birthday, but because... He paused, clearly searching for the right words. I've realized how much I've missed moments like this. Me too, I said, a lump forming in my throat. It's been a long time since we've been this close. He nodded, his gaze intense yet gentle. You remind me so much of your mother, he said again, but this time his voice carried a deeper emotion. Not just in the way you look, but in the way you make everything feel brighter, warmer. She had that same light, and you've carried it on in ways I don't think you even realize. The lump in my throat grew, and I set my mug down, suddenly overwhelmed. I know this might sound strange, he continued, leaning slightly closer, but tonight, seeing you, hearing you laugh, watching you in that dress, it's like I've seen you for the first time. Not just as my daughter, but as this incredible, beautiful woman. My breath hitched at his words, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at him, my heart racing. There was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, that made it impossible to look away. I hope I haven't said too much, he added, his voice quieter now. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. It's just a lot to take in. He gave me a small smile, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. The touch was so gentle, so deliberate, that I found myself leaning into it without thinking. You're everything to me, he said softly. You always have been. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. His lips brushed mine, soft and hesitant, as if testing the waters. The world seemed to stop in that moment. The warmth of his kiss, the way his hand cupped my face, the unspoken emotions passing between us. It was overwhelming and unfamiliar, yet it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, filled with both vulnerability and uncertainty. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't have. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. No, I said, my voice trembling. Don't apologize. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling between us. I didn't know what it meant or where we would go from here, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tonight had changed everything.